Thanks so much for being with us today. We are joined in the studio by Captain Shannon Smith with the Somerset Police Department, and we are doing a special edition of On the Air with the Somerset Police Department today. It's a special edition because it is Peace Officers Memorial Day, and today we'll be doing a tribute to the fallen officers of the Somerset Police Department. And Captain Smith, you and I have talked about these stories in the past. You're extremely knowledgeable on this subject. Thanks so much for taking the time to come in today and get this recorded for history and the people out there.
Greg, thanks for having us as always, and it is a special edition for a special day. With today, May 15th, being Peace Officers Memorial Day across the United States. That day was first put into effect by President Kennedy back in 1962, and whatever day May 15 falls upon, that week is also designated as National Police Week. And in Washington, D.C., all this week leading up to today and into tomorrow, there are a number of ceremonies at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, honor guard competitions, but more importantly, a lot of honor for those people who have sacrificed in the line of duty in law enforcement, federal, state, local agencies across the board. And we appreciate letting us be here to talk a little bit about the 3 officers that the Somerset Police Department has lost in the line of duty in our 127-year history.
And now we can go, to start this thing off, we go way back to 1928, and we've got the story of Officer Silas West, correct?
Silas was chief of police, actually, at the time in January 15th of 1928. He and Patrolman McKinley Massingale were out on patrol, and they made contact with Perry Chumley down at the depot, back when the depot was really a hot spot part of town.
Now, what part of town is that now? Where was the depot then?
It is where it is now, in basically the same location there in the vicinity of South Main and Bourne Avenue. That
Okay.
part of it hasn't changed. But unlike today's times, it was a very hot spot because we were a major city, so to speak, along the rail line, and there were a lot of people coming and going via railway, visiting and stopping here for the night via rail. So they made contact with Perry Chumley down there and actually made an arrest and ordered him to appear in court the following day for being drunk out in public. There was another gentleman with him by the name of V.O. Burton, and Mr. Burton actually promised the officers that he would take care of him and take him to his home. What happened later was Perry Chumley became increasingly angry about being charged. So he left Burton's house and told Burton as he left that he was going to go get those officers. Burton, after Chumley left, made contact with the officers to let them know that, in fact, Chumley had left the residence and they needed to be on the lookout for him. And at about 8:55 p.m. on that Sunday evening, January 15, Silas West is driving his personal car, which seemed to be the norm back then as a patrolling officer. And McKinley Massingale was a patrolman with him. And they spotted Chumley on the south side of the square in front of the Southern Mercantile Company. They got out of the car, and Chief West walked up to Perry Chumley and was almost in the process of putting his hands on him to arrest him when Chumley pulled out a revolver and started shooting at the chief. And he actually shot him 2 times, once in the chest and once in the right middle finger. Chief West at the time actually had a flashlight in his hand, and the bullet striking his finger made him drop the flashlight and really rendered his right hand useless at that time. He told friends from his hospital bed later that he retrieved his revolver with his left hand and shot at Chumley 6 times. At about the same time that was going on, McKinley Massingale was exiting West's car and returned fire upon Chumley as well. Both those officers shot every round in their gun, 6 for a total of 12. 10 of those shots actually struck Chumley, and he died in front of the Tandy Barber Shop on the south side of the square almost instantly. Chief West at that time walked himself to the hospital while suffering a bullet wound to the chest and to the hand, but the hospital at the time was located at the intersection of North Main Street and West Columbia Street. So he didn't have a long walk, but he's
been shot twice.
He's been shot twice. That takes a man to do that.
Yeah.
So it looked like there might be some improvement, or at least his condition might level off over the night. But as the reports from the news at the time said, his pulse became increasingly weaker, and he died exactly 12 hours after the shooting began at 8:55 the following morning.
Well, can you give us any more information about Silas West? Who was he? How did he rise to be chief of police here in Somerset? What's his background?
Chief West actually was previously employed by the city of Somerset in another civilian job, and he had retired after 25 years with Southern Railway, then went to work for the city, and then started out as a patrolman. And he was in his second term as chief of police when he was killed. A lot of people described him as being a very hard worker, being fearless. He played an integral part in a lot of federal cases, and actually the week before he was killed was in Lexington testifying in a case in federal court in Lexington that he was a key witness in.
And I believe that he is buried right here in the Somerset Cemetery. Isn't that right?
He is. He's buried in the city of Somerset Cemetery. A side note to his burial, much in the same way a lot of people erroneously write the previous year after New Year's, like on checks and other written materials. It looks like the stonecutter at the time mistakenly used the previous year when they were making his tombstone, and his actual death date shows January 16 of 1927.
Right.
It actually should have been 1928.
Well, there was just 1 month into the year, so a lot of people make that mistake.
16 days. It happens to a lot of us, but
it's a lot worse when it's set in stone than when you write it on a check, though, isn't it?
Exactly.
Well, I know you've done a ton of research here, and again, it's not facts that you can just easily find anywhere, all of them. What are some of the things you did to find out about these fallen officers?
Well, a lot of it came from researching newspaper articles. Several years ago, I spent a lot of time at the University of Kentucky Library looking at old archives of newspapers and looking at local newspaper resources, internet resources, a lot of different things. It's key in research like this not to rely on just one source, to find as many different angles about the incident as possible, and compile the information from there. So it's been a long trek, but in the process we've been able to identify a lot of other parts of our Somerset Police Department history that we didn't know.
Yes, sir. Well, let's move on to our next officer here. And interestingly enough, the next officer to fall in the line of duty was actually on the scene for the first officer. Exactly.
McKinley Messingale was in the car with Silas West a year and 9 months earlier in 1928 when Chief West was killed. And unfortunately, he met the same demise Halloween night of 1929. And that all began when two other police officers, Jim Jasper and Sam Waddle, conducted a bootlegging raid on South Maple Street of a restaurant there at about 10:30 p.m. While they were there, they actually did locate some liquor, and they arrested the restaurant's owner, a man by the name of Jim Hill. During the course of searching this place, another person showed up, and that person's name was Alfred Thurman. And as the officers walked Hill to jail, for a short period of time, Alfred Thurman followed them. And after they got the booking and everything done, they ran into Patrolman McKinley Massengale. And Massengale told the officers that he thought he knew the location of a trap door that might reveal some more liquor inside that restaurant. So at about 12:30, the three of them, plus a night watchman that had been watching Somerset schools during Halloween the previous evening, at about 12:30, the four of them went back to the restaurant to finish that search. Sam Waddle had placed the keys to the front door in his pocket as he left the first half of this raid, the first half of this search, and he was in the process of retrieving the front door keys when from inside the dark, unlit restaurant, two shots rang out, one through the front door and one through the front window. Now, to give you a little idea of what it looked like at that time, the news reports of the time indicate that the inside of the restaurant was dark and the outside on the street was lit by the street lamps. So the officers were silhouetted, making it easy for somebody inside to see the officers outside getting ready to make entrance into the restaurant.
And probably all they're seeing is their reflection in the glass.
All they're seeing is an outline.
Right. Yeah,
exactly, a silhouette. So two shots rang out. The officers returned fire, and Patrolman Jim Jasper ran around to the back of the business where a sliding glass door was. When he got around there, he saw a figure coming out of that sliding glass door and running. He fired shots at that person, and he disappeared into the woods, and they didn't see him again. One of their first steps was to get a bloodhound team in there. So a man who had bloodhounds came in and tracked the person that had run off, and they tracked him all the way to Vine Street to Alfred Thurman's home, the man who was previously at the establishment when the officers were arresting Jim Hill. They arrested Alfred Thurman, and Thurman proved to be the person in the sliding glass door that Jim Jasper fired at to try to stop and arrest at the time. At the time, broadcasts were sent out to all police agencies and also radio stations, who gave out a broadcast that there was a reward being offered of $400 for the capture of Ivan Hunter. Now,
this is 1929, $400.
Precisely, which equals almost $5,500 in today's money. So that was a sizable amount to solicit the public's help in trying to find Ivan Hunter. Now, 2 nights later, on November 3, there is a Somerset realtor by the name of W.B. Denny. He's visiting his parents in the Mill Springs community of Wayne County, and he actually sees Ivan Hunter at the home of a man by the name of George Copenhaver. Without the availability of telephones at the time, Denny drives all the way back to Somerset, and he gets Chief Robert Warren and Pulaski County Sheriff Jack Edwards that information, and they in turn go right down to Wayne County to Copenhaver's house and find Ivan Hunter and place him under arrest. But they actually took him to the Danville jail for safekeeping, which with some of the newspaper articles I've read about arrests and things like that, that was not uncommon, especially when
afraid he might be lynched or something to that effect, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it was for the prisoner safekeeping that he was taken to Danville. But he eventually confessed and said that he was the one who fired the shots, but he said he fired the shots only at the command of Alfred Thurman, who was in the building with him at the time Massengale was killed. He also claimed to have been drunk and told the officers that he would have killed anybody who tried to come in that business that night. He told the officers that he used a .38 caliber revolver and told the officers where that revolver could be found in Copenhaver's home, and it was eventually recovered. And from tying in all the evidence, it was determined that Massengale was indeed shot in the chest one time with a .38 caliber round. So after the sun came up the next morning, officers did a complete detailed search of the restaurant, and that search revealed a number of secret compartments throughout the restaurant. They found a number of whiskey bottles, kegs, and half-gallon liquor jars. Also in the attic of the restaurant, they found a keg, and connected to that keg was plastic tubing that led down to a hidden faucet in the wall of the adjacent undertaking business. Now, that undertaking business is key to this event because Ivan Hunter also told the officers after he shot McKinley Massengale, he went to the connected and adjacent undertaking business and hid in a coffin until officers left. After they left, he fled the scene on foot and walked all the way to Wayne County.
Because, of course, they're chasing the other guy, bloodhounds, everything. They're after the guy running out the back door.
Exactly. Right. At that time, they really had no idea that there were two people inside or two people involved. The trapdoor McKinley Massengale originally told the officers about was, in fact, found, and they did find several liquor bottles inside a cellar, a secret cellar that led down into the basement.
Kind of sounds to me like, back here during Prohibition, this place might have pretty much been the Somerset Speakeasy is what it sounds like to me.
It may very well have been, especially with a method in which to dispense the liquor.
Yeah.
Not just having the product there, but a manner in which to fill a cup or a jar or whatever from a hidden keg, a hidden delivery system. So very, very much
they were in real business with this going on. This wasn't just a fly-by-night, we have some alcohol. This was a business.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Operating much in the same sense that a bar would.
Right, yeah.
But I'm sure on a very clandestine level, as most federal and state and local resources toward vice-type things was dedicated toward prohibition enforcement.
Well, now that we have Hunter in custody, do we know what happens with his trial and the history of that?
We do. Both of them, Alfred Thurman and Ivan Hunter, were arrested. Hunter was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Thurman was charged and convicted of manslaughter, but was also sentenced to life in prison. Not sure of how manslaughter nowadays doesn't carry a penalty that stiff. So the end result is both of them were sentenced to a life term for the death of Patrolman McKinley Massengale.
Well, it sounds to me like maybe it was that they don't really know for sure exactly what happened inside there, but they know they were both involved. They both did it. It was in cold blood. It was a police officer. I mean, I think maybe that was just, we don't really know what happened, and they gave them both life sentences might be the bottom line there.
Exactly. One thing we don't know is what Ivan Hunter and Alfred Thurman's involvement in that business might have been.
Were they business? Yes.
Were they employees? Were they the people responsible for maybe stocking or retrieving, buying the liquor that they could sell there? Were they patrons? What were they? And unfortunately, the news records and the archives that we have found simply don't fill in the blanks as to why they were there in the first place. Some interesting parts of the trial is on Alfred Thurman. The jury deliberated for about 3 hours before returning their verdict. When Ivan Hunter went to trial, they were not able to find a jury of Pulaski County men, as the newspaper describes. So the judge, R.C. Tarter at the time, actually had the sheriff go retrieve 60 men from Rockcastle County to select a jury from. And that jury, when determining Ivan Hunter's sentence, or guilt or innocence, I should say, only deliberated 20 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty.
So probably they couldn't find impartial jurors. Somebody knew one or the other. Somebody probably was what was going on there. Would you say?
Exactly. The interesting thing there is that it was only men at the time.
Only men. And even though he was held in Danville for his own protection, the trial was here in Pulaski County.
That's correct. And they didn't move the trial to Rockcastle County. They moved the jurors from Rockcastle to Pulaski.
Interesting. Well, our next fallen hero, moving on, is a name that most people in this area are familiar with. It's a story here that many people have heard about, but not a lot of folks anymore know the true details about. I'm talking about Catron, but we're talking about Harold Catron.
That's right. A lot of people know the story about Sheriff Sam Catron that was killed in April of 2002. And a lot of people know about his father being killed also, but some may not. Sam's father, Harold, served as our chief of police from 1950 until 1964 at the time of his death. His place in our timeline starts out on April the 10th, 1957, when he and his son Lewis were on the front porch of their Jasper Street home when a black Buick came off of Jasper Street and made a right turn onto Hawkins Avenue very slowly with only one person inside the vehicle, and the driver leaned over and fired a shotgun directly at Chief Catron as he was leaned over. After that point, the vehicle sped off westbound on Hawkins Avenue, made a left turn and went south on May Street, and went out of sight. Chief Catron stumbled inside, asked his wife to call an ambulance and call the police. And in short time, the officers from state, county, and city had the major roadways leading out of Somerset blocked off looking for this black Buick. About 45 minutes later, the Buick was found parked on South Maple Street in front of Hughes Department Store. Two people were next to it by the name of James Farley and James Mounts. Now, Farley disobeyed officers' commands and actually made an aggressive move, and he was shot by officers. The car ended up being a 1938 Buick. It was registered to a Somerset resident, 20-year-old Robert Atlee Stevens. Somerset Police ended up charging Stevens as well as James Mounts and another gentleman named Lawrence Spears, who went by the nickname of Fats, with shooting Chief Catron and his son Lewis. Lewis ended up suffering 4 shotgun pellets to the arm. Chief Catron suffered wounds to his right side and back when 89 pellets actually struck him from that shotgun blast.
And it was one shot, right? It was the spread that hit them both. Is that correct?
It was one single gunshot, and it was a shotgun, so it had a pattern of small pellets that spread out and struck them. Those 3 men, Stevens, Mounts, and Spears, were all held over to the May 1957 grand jury. And the grand jury only returned an indictment against Robert Stevens. Now, during a preliminary hearing, Somerset police officers testified that Robert Stevens had in fact threatened Chief Catron back in 1954. Another one testified that about 10 days prior to the shooting, they arrested Stevens for loitering, and at that time he told officers he had a 16-gauge shotgun and he'd like to use it on someone. Well, when the officers searched the car the night Chief Catron was shot and the night the car was found, they in fact found a spent hull from a 16-gauge shotgun that had what's called a number 4 size shot in the round, and that turned out to be the same size shot that inflicted Chief Catron and Lewis Catron's wounds. Mm-hmm. On May 8th, 1957, the grand jury returned that single indictment against Stevens, charging him with 2 counts of malicious shooting and wounding. He went to trial on June 25th, 1957, and the results of that trial was a hung jury. Now, the judge ordered a September 1957 retrial, and about a week before that, on August 26, Robert Stevens borrowed his brother's 1949 Lincoln and a 12-gauge shotgun, as he said, to go squirrel hunting with. However, Robert drove to what's now considered East Bourbon Road off of Monticello Street, and pulled off to the side of the road to let traffic pass by him. Then, according to a lady that was on her front porch nearby, he got out of the 1949 Lincoln, retrieved the 12-gauge shotgun from the back seat of the car, placed the shotgun to his chest, and shot and killed himself.
One thing we should point out here for the story and the people listening is that, interestingly enough, Harold Catron is not dead at this point.
That's correct.
Right. He wasn't shot dead on his porch at this point. Let's clarify that.
Exactly. Both Harold and Lewis went to the hospital for treatment. Lewis was released. Chief Catron stayed in for some time, but was released, went back to work, and we see newspaper articles not too far off in the future where he's back to work, doing
apparently fine,
as much of his normal duties as he possibly can. But that all came to change on September 16th of 1964, when one of those 89 pellets that struck Chief Catron became dislodged and caused a heart attack and ultimately his death on that day. So it was evident that the reason he was shot was because of his status as the police chief.
I think it's very appropriate that even though it sometime later a heart attack was caused by one of these pellets, I think it's completely appropriate that he's still considered to have been killed in the line of duty, correct?
Yes, you can tie the death to the heart attack to the bullets,
exactly.
The bullets to the shooting that took place April 10, 1957.
And again, the Catron the Elder, that's a story that a lot of people in this area have heard about, but not really heard the details of. So
exactly, and he was a strong member of our community. We have an early photograph in the late 1930s of Harold Catron as a patrolman for the Somerset Police Department. He left and went into the private hardware business for a period of time before serving in World War II. Came back and served as fire chief, and then in January 1950 began his term as chief of police of the city of Somerset.
Well, something I want to make sure that you share with people, because when we talked about this in the past, there were so many, what to me are just mind-blowing synchronicities in so many of these cases. Share some of those with people, because some of them are just bizarre.
Right. We talked about doing this for the past couple of years, and it just never did come to be, and we're glad it is finally coming. But I think one of the things that I caught your interest with was the connections between each of these incidents. And the first one's pretty obvious. When Silas West was shot on the square in 1928, with him was Patrolman McKinley Massengale, who was shot and killed in 1929. When McKinley Massengale was killed, he had with him a patrolman by the name of Jim Jasper. Well, Jim Jasper also served later on as chief of police of the city of Somerset and sheriff of Pulaski County, and it was in his position as sheriff that he was ambushed in July of 1952 and killed in the line of duty himself. We talked about Robert Stevens' 1938 Buick being located on South Maple Street about 45 minutes after Harold Catron's shooting. South Maple Street, also the location where McKinley Massengale was killed.
Practically the very spot,
within visual range. Yeah, right. In reading some of the newspaper articles, I learned that a man by the name of W.E. Hunter, I think no relation to Ivan Hunter, actually presided over both Silas West and McKinley Massengale's funerals. So, and all three of these men are buried within eyeshot of one another in our own Somerset Cemetery.
Right there in Somerset Cemetery. Well, again, we've been doing a special edition of On the Air with the Somerset Police Department, and we're here with Captain Shannon Smith with the Somerset Police. And let's just clarify here that we have been doing the police department today. There are other fallen heroes. We do realize that.
Yes, and we want everybody to know that we're not excluding them. We're honoring those who served with our police department. There's certainly been several from the Pulaski County Sheriff's Department. We mentioned Sheriff Catchern a minute ago. Also, there's been a number from Burnside. You wouldn't think Burnside would have that many, but there's also officers from the former Kentucky Highway Patrol that have been killed in the line of duty here, and we're not excluding those guys. They deserve as much honor and respect as ours. But this is our opportunity as the Somerset Police Department to honor those officers that served with our agency. And again, thank you very much for having us here and giving us the opportunity to do this and educate our public a little bit about where we've been in the past.
Well, thank you so much. Again, this has been a tribute to the fallen officers of the Somerset Police Department in honor of Police Officers Memorial Day with Captain Shannon Smith of the Somerset Police Department. Captain Smith, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.